All right, so much happening in South Africa of late. What does this all mean for South Africans at this very moment, at this very time? Let's get some analysis now and introduce political analyst Khanyi Magubane. And we're hoping to be joined by Ongama Mtimka via Skype a little later on in this conversation to get you all sides, I guess, and get some analysis and break this down in terms of what this means for South Africans at this current time. Khanyi,
yes.
Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure having you and getting your perspective. It comes at a time when a former president, there's a warrant of arrest issued for him, albeit it stayed until the 6th of May. Then we have the current president who's in court battling with the public protector. What does this all mean?
Well, I think it's definitely the first time in our history that such has happened, that concurrently we see two legal cases involving a former head of state and a current and sitting head of state. But I think the cases are very different, but in terms of what it all means, well, number one, we have to be, suspicious of what is happening in the higher echelons, of this country, because we know that the office of the president, the deputy president's office, those are supposed to be, for all intents and purposes, pure and devoid of corruption and allegations. Those should be the offices that South Africans need to look to, because they are the first citizens of this country. So if we look at it from that perspective, when the former first citizen and the current first citizen of this country is in court, what kind of a message is it sending it out to the rest of the country? Do we have...
And the rest of the world.
And the rest of the world. Do we have confidence in those officers?
Right.
Remember, President Ramaphosa went live on television, the day that the report came out from the Public Protector's Office. And the main intention of that live broadcast was to assure the country that the office of the presidency is still intact, he's still in control, and everything is still business as usual.
If you have to flip it on its head, though, and look at it from a point of view that outsiders are looking at it, maybe saying that, well, they have recourse. If they, angry about something or they disagree with something, the judiciary is functioning, it's independent, and this is what makes South Africa tick.
Well, ultimately, on the converse side, like you said, the president's office does have a duty to defend itself, because it wants to maintain its good standing and its good name. Remember that when I go back to that live press conference that he did, or that live, the televised live broadcast, where the president said that we are going to take this on review. And that's the process that's currently underway. We do have the opposing sides. Magubane has said that you have deliberately misled a parliament. Okay, you have violated the executive ethics code. You've done a myriad of things. And the president is saying, your jurisdiction does not extend to the matters pertaining to my private campaign, because I was not acting in the capacity as a president. I was acting in the capacity of an ANC leader, and it's only in my capacity as a president. If I'd done something as the president of South Africa, then the executive ethics code comes into play. But I was a politician and a member of the ANC. I was campaigning with Lindiwe Sisulu, with Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, and all the other candidates. So actually you don't have jurisdiction into that space.
That can be argued legally in court, but in the court of public opinion, does it really matter?
It doesn't matter. The details are salacious, to say the least. It's mudslinging left, right and center. We've seen lawyers for the president saying that she has misread the code, and the public saying, well, if Magubane doesn't understand the law, why is she even the public protector? Because she's an advocate, because the position was created for somebody with a legal background for a reason, because all her cases have to apply to laws. That's how she investigates. That's how she comes to the conclusion of her cases. It's because of laws that apply to it. Even in her reports, she does a legal review, to say this is the legislative framework of this case, and these are the laws that have been contravened. And she says she has fulfilled that mandate. And so the president is now going to have a tough job to say that, how did Magubane misread the law? It's a legal battle. It's a legal eagle battle, if I can put it. It may go a little over our heads sometimes. So I think for us, the juicy bit is really, in the mudslinging of whose office says what. But the public protector should remain steadfast. We've seen that her legal team is not stepping back. Let's see what comes out of Tembeka Nxukaitobi's team and Tim Wengrove. Let's see what comes out of that. But I think we're still going to see a very tedious legal battle of definitions and interpretations of law. That's where the case is really going to sit for a long time before any interesting evidence comes out that we laymen, members of the public, may find interesting. So people, brush up on your legal knowledge.
It's difficult. It's
brush
difficult.
up on your legal knowledge, because that's what it is. You know what I'm saying? It's statutes versus statutes. It's a law versus law. Because the office of the president, at the end of the day, you know, has to prove that the president, in his capacity as an ANC member, has the right to accept donations. Now, the nature of the donation itself, that's another issue we haven't even touched on.
I mean, legal issues are either black and white, but when you start reading between the lines, it gets a bit interesting. Let's look at public opinion, as we were talking about. In the case of former President Jacob Zuma, we've learnt that he has undergone 2 operations this year, in fact, and also seeking medical treatment abroad. We heard from Zuma's lawyer yesterday, Daniel Mancha, saying that the court is sending out a wrong message by issuing a warrant of arrest, albeit it states until the 6th of May, and, you know, saying that the court should showing no sympathy and no compassion. When you hear what the judge had to say, she was saying that she's doing everything that is required from her in terms of the law. When we look at this, how does the public read this? And does this have any impact and sway Zuma's base?
You know, it's funny, driving to the SABC this morning, I saw a headline that says Zuma in the sick note. And that's really where the conversation has been, the validity of the medical records that were produced before Judge Daya Pillay. Now, she threw it out to say that there were inconsistencies, that, you know, there were things scratched out and dates changed. You know, the nuts and bolts didn't really fit together as far as that defense went, and that's why she threw it out. But let's just take a few step backs, and let's just remember who, you know, President Jacob Zuma is. He's a former head of state. And this illness that he has is said to be treated at the level of a military hospital. Now, we know that that's where heads of states and that's where former heads of states are treated. If we think back, you know, to 2015, when former President Nelson Mandela was being treated, he was in a military hospital after being in Mill Park for a long time. And there were regular updates from his medical team. This should have been handled at that level. So by now, we should have heard from the Defense Force, if their military medical team is handling the case. We should have heard from the family beforehand, before even today's case. We should have received a statement that says the Zuma family would like to formally notify South Africans that former President Jacob Zuma is unwell. Maybe give a little bit of background, what they can tell us, but bring us into their confidence, you know, that this is a case involving a former head of state that is now so gravely ill that he is in Cuba receiving medical treatment. So even on the face of it, they're saying that there was no medical facility in South Africa, you know, that could treat it. Whatever the nature is, I mean, there's been issues of poisoning that have been thrown around before. And if I'm not mistaken, he's been to Russia even at some point for treatment. I could be mistaken on that point, but it's been an ongoing illness. Show us a picture of the man in hospital. Give us something to go on.
But what about his privacy as a citizen of South Africa? I mean, patient-doctor confidentiality is crucial, isn't it? I mean, I wouldn't want to for the public to know what I'm going through, neither would you, I assume. But him being a public figure, I saw some arguments being made on social media that him being a public figure, we should know. Should we?
All right, so I'm going to draw into media law, right? Because media law has a subsection called the right to privacy versus public interest, right? So now there's privacy as relates to private individuals, and there's privacy as it relates to public individuals. Now, the right to privacy when it relates to public individuals has to be weighed against public interest. So what is the public's interest in knowing that he's sick? Yes, we do have a public interest to know that he is ill. Is it public interest for us to know what exactly, you know, he's suffering from, or what exactly the ailment is? No, we don't need to know.
Yeah.
That's where his sense of privacy comes in. But to let us know that the man is ill, yes, because if they don't, they're going to have to, continually fight these perceptions that he's running away from his day in court.
Yeah.
And we know that for many, many years, former President Jacob Zuma said, I want my day in court.
Yeah.
I want to clear myself of this 500,000 bribe that I allegedly took, from the French arms manufacturing company. So for him to do that, again, guys, control your own narrative.
Right.
Give us the story before you become the story.
So it becomes almost a PR issue, isn't it, in terms of communicating effectively?
Yes.
How can they come back? If you had the ear, of whoever's, doing this or handling this issue.
If we had Olivia Pope to come in and deal with this issue.
Well, how would you fix this?
Well, being the fixer. Okay, all right, first things first, we need transparency. I think that's what I've been alluding to. So right now they are reactionary. They are reacting to the court's, decision to issue the warrant of arrest. What happens now is saying the family did not want to speak, but we are now forced to speak due to the circumstances that have now unfolded in court. This is the situation. That's how you come back. You acknowledge what happened in court, but you still control it and you give out the information. And then end that off by saying we will be submitting further documents to the court, to substantiate our case.
Yeah.
And we would, please respect our privacy at this time. It is a difficult time for us. Cry, cry, cry.
Yeah.
You need that.
Can you stand by? I want to bring in Ongama Mtimka now. He is via the telephone, I understand. He joins us now live. Ongama, pleasure having you on the program. I just want to take a look at what's happening in the Gauteng High Court in Pretoria. Cyril Ramaphosa's review of a report by the public protector that found he had deliberately misled Parliament and recommended an investigation by the police into possible money laundering. Do you see this legal battle between President Ramaphosa and Advocate Magubane being used in what some will refer to as factional battles ahead of the ANC's National General Council in June?
This is a legal political minefield, Blaine. Thank you, by the way, for having me. Good morning, and good morning to your guests and listeners and viewers. I think it's a legal minefield in the sense that the trigger for it cannot be said to have been, ANC factional battles. We know that this came from a legitimate parliamentary question. In fact, it was a follow-through from a political question. So a parliamentary question. What became what makes this to be drawn to ANC party political factions is the extent to which Magubane then extended what was understood to be the scope of the investigation to also include the donations to the CR campaign, apparently in their entirety, rather than the specific one which was asked in Parliament. And she justifies her, interest in that, in the report at least, by saying, well, she stumbled upon information that looked suspicious and do what was appropriate for a public protector in terms of the preliminary investigations, and then makes the reference to the law enforcement agencies in order to determine whether what appears to be cases of money laundering, which she has identified, are investigated. So for me, while the argument can be made about ANC factional interests and approaches in this, we cannot simply rule it out as that. It's much more complex than that. I think Ramaphosa's team may be successful in delineating the scope of what ought to be considered. Because if you look at legislation guiding party funding, which is new in itself, it doesn't go beyond inter-party competition in an election. In fact, So all it does is it outlines what's required and what are the legal parameters for party political funding, but it doesn't go into private electoral campaigns of ANC president. And for me, that's a more legitimate discussion to be had than the one that was difficult to prove about ANC sectional battle.
Look, I
even
guess
though
what
we can actually make those
yeah,
inferences.
I hear you, Ongama, but what I'm actually asking is in terms of this legal battle and the potential of this legal battle spilling into the political realm. Give us some possible scenarios here. If the president wins this case, what bearing will this have on the public protector and vice versa? And, you know, what will it mean for the DA's motion in Parliament for her removal? How do you see this playing out?
So the public protector has been the battering ram, you know, on the ANC, especially President Ramaphosa's power configuration, because it's not only the president, but also Minister Pravin Gordhan and others who are being targeted in his camp. So winning this case for the president would have huge ramifications politically. It would help neutralize the storm that's brewing inside the ANC and some of the claims which may be made by those in the opposing faction leading up to the NGC who want to either have him removed or embarrassed at the NGC. As far as the parliamentary process of looking into the public protector's fitness to hold office, a negative finding on this issue would actually render her gone, because you see, within the parliament, there's already traction that's been gained in parliament for her removal. And in fact, those who are supporting her, such as Supra Mahumapelo, may not have any leg to stand on should she be found to be wanting, especially if the mistakes that are identified are not mistakes of law, but deliberate conduct in bad faith, such as, for example, and the question is going to be asked about the leaks of the bank statement.
Right.
You see, part of the challenge, and people want to compare this with the Gupta leaks. With the Gupta leaks, is they first were in the public domain before being cited by the public protector. But in this instance, in fact, they first landed themselves in her office before they were in the public domain. So that's a huge difference. So what it does is it doesn't paint a picture of somebody who benefited from a leak, but someone who may well be urged to have played a role in actually, getting to those documents.
Khanyi, how do you see this being played out? I mean, when President Cyril Ramaphosa came into office, he came in on the ticket of cleaning up, so to speak, and getting foreign direct investment into the country. If he loses this case, does he have the moral authority in order to go after corrupt officials?
Wow, that's a heavy one to throw on him. I think that his office requires him to do that despite of himself.
Yeah.
You know, so the function of the office doesn't change, whether the president is guilty or not. What does change is our confidence in the office. You know, so it's more from the office to the public, it's more from the public to the office. You know, the presidency of Cyril Ramaphosa has been difficult, to say the least. You know, there have been many points where the public has looked to him, for leadership, and we've been left wanting, you know. So this case would be just yet another thing that we felt that the Ramaphosa presidency failed to really nip in the bud, because we remember that there was the GBV issue, you know, of gender-based violence, you know, and many activists and feminists saying that, you know, that the president is not really reacting the way that he wants to the issue of ESCOM, and the president saying that he was surprised, you know, by all the outages, and that he was going to try, you know, and deal with it, and the public saying, how can you be surprised and why don't you know? You know, so there have been many parts where the president's office has not managed to bring the people's confidence back into him. And if he loses this case, it will be difficult to go after corrupt officials, because they can turn around and say, but isn't that the kettle calling the pot black?
Yeah.
You know, but I still think that shouldn't really, you know, deter him to say, oh, because now I've been found guilty, now I'm not going to go after, you know, corrupt officials. You know, the Zondo Commission will still continue, and other investigations. It will still be business as usual, but he will be the one that takes the biggest knock from the foreign direct investment confidence. You know, how will the outside business world have confidence in us? We are spending millions upon millions of rands attracting foreign direct investments. We're having investment summits. We are bringing the people to South Africa to come and see the land of opportunity. We have MECs and ministers actively meeting, you know, business delegations, showing them destination Gauteng, destination South Africa. But what is destination South Africa from a political stability point of view? Because foreign investors want to invest in countries that are politically stable. And this destabilizes South Africa if the president loses, because ultimately that's what it boils down to. You know, the country will be unstable from a political point of view. From a functioning point of view, maybe not so much. But, you know, somebody wanting to put down a 5 billion rand check, you know, and deciding, do I or don't I think that this is going to also call for another PR exercise to bring the business community back into the confidence of the president, who has prided himself at being at platforms like Davos, where, you know, he didn't go. He's always been at those platforms where he's meeting top business leaders. We saw Tito Mboweni going there, you know, representing South Africa, with the president said to be dealing with domestic issues. You know, so I think that it will serve him a bit of humble pie, but if he's got the right handlers around him, he could use that to turn things around for himself, to say that maybe I do have to account and say, I'm sorry guys, I didn't understand maybe procedures of donations or whatever, you know, but in a way mitigate the damage, because it will cause, you know, some sort of brand value to come down of the president's office.
And Ongama, I mean, the president, Cyril Ramaphosa, is about to take over a very crucial body, the chairpersonship of the African Union. How will this affect, you know, perceptions out there? If in fact he loses, when somebody from outside looking in, do you agree with Khanyi that it's going to have a negative effect?
Well, the African Union, in terms of Agenda 2063, has identified corruption and getting rid of and improving governance in the continent as one of the key, targets. So it's important that South Africa, which has certain example militarily and in terms of managing its democracy, continues to be seen as credible enough to be able to lead the continent in terms of moving towards cleaner states in the continent. So in terms of the ability to inspire that direction with credibility, there's a threat there, especially given the fact that now, in terms of the ranking, the latest rankings I saw recently, that place us very high up in terms of corruption in the world. It doesn't bode well for in terms of that. But also there's a lot more factors that are weakening the stature of the president in terms of what he's trying to do in the country. There's no sense that momentum is building in a positive way. I suspect that maybe this year, as the NPA pounces on the powerful politicians that are fingered in state capture, regardless of what faction they belong to, that may help to change perceptions about what exactly constitutes the new dawn. I saw yesterday, I hope, where some claims were made that the RAND responded positively with the issuing of the warrant of arrest for President Zuma. Now, at first, that sounds like too much of a stretch to link, but at the same time, one can understand it, that if there has been a sense in which people feel that nothing ever gets done around corruption, and that's important for the investing community, well, what it then means is that each time positive gains are made to go against those that have been very corrupt in the country. It's a positive step in the right direction for South Africa.
Khanyi, I heard the ANC spokesperson, Pulemabe, reportedly said that the ANC supports both the president and the public, the Chapter 9 institutions. It's not necessarily about the individual. But when the two are going head to head, can you not pick a side or go down the middle, play it down the middle?
Well, I mean, it's party and state. You know, it's always been the contestation between party and state. And I would expect the ANC to support former President Jacob Zuma and President Jacob Zuma because they are their members. You know, as far as, you know, the cases that are before the courts are concerned, perhaps the process should be allowed to unfold and there shouldn't be political meddling from the ANC to try and influence results in any given direction. I think the ANC must be clear about where it stands in terms of its support, but not try to use organs of state to influence a particular outcome. And so it's going to be interesting how they will try and push. I mean, make no mistake, they will use the court of public opinion to try and push on the issue, and they are free to make pronouncements and release statements and do all those kind of things. But do not, for me, meddle in the legal process. Let it unfold.
Look, there's so much more to discuss.
Let everyone have their day in court.
But we'll bring you back. We'll bring you back. We'll get your insight. As always, we appreciate your time and your perspective, as well as Ongama Mtimka. This is Khanyi Magubane, political analyst. Appreciate your time, guys. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.